Most people think reading others requires magic, a gift some are born with and others are not. It doesn't. It requires attention. The world is loud with talk and quiet with truth, and the people who seem to just know what's really going on in a room are not psychics. They are watchers. They have trained themselves to notice what everyone else is too busy performing to see. This book will not teach you tricks. It will teach you to see clearly, the shift in a shoulder before a decision is made, the silence that means more than the sentence that follows it, the smile that arrives a half-second too late to be real. These are not secrets. They are patterns. And patterns can be learned. By the end of these 15 chapters, you will no longer be at the mercy of what people say. You will understand what they mean. There is no such thing as a perfect poker face. What people call composure is often just a slower leak, the same truth escaping through smaller cracks. A person who has trained themselves not to flinch will still swallow. Still blink half a second longer. Still choose their words with a care that betrays exactly how much they are managing. The mistake most people make when trying to read others is searching for one big tell, the dead giveaway, the smoking gun. But people rarely hand you the truth in one clean gesture. They leak it slowly, across many small choices, and the leak is always there if you know where composure tends to crack. Composure is expensive. It costs energy to maintain a face that doesn't match what's underneath, and energy that's spent holding a mask still shows up somewhere, in stillness that's too still, in an answer that comes too fast, in eye contact held a beat too long because someone is trying to prove they have nothing to hide. The performance of calm and the presence of calm look almost identical, except for one thing: real calm doesn't need to be performed. This is where most people go wrong when they try to read others. They look at the mask instead of the muscles holding it up. They listen to the sentence instead of watching the effort it took to build it. If you want to know what someone actually feels, stop watching their face for an expression and start watching their body for the cost of maintaining one. Practice this the next time you're in a tense conversation. Instead of asking, "What is this person saying?" ask, "What does it look like this is costing them to say it calmly?" That single shift in attention will tell you more than 100 books on facial expressions ever could, because it stops treating the poker face as a wall, and starts treating it as evidence. Consider the difference between a person who is genuinely relaxed in a difficult meeting and a person who is working hard to appear that way. The genuinely relaxed person's stillness varies naturally, they shift, they gesture, their expression moves with the conversation because there is nothing underneath being contained. The performer's stillness is uniform, deliberate, almost architectural. It doesn't breathe the way natural calm breathes. Once you have seen this distinction a handful of times, you will never unsee it again. It becomes as obvious as the difference between a real smile and a photograph smile, something everyone can feel intuitively but few can name, until now. There is also a temporal element to composure that most people miss entirely. Watch not just how someone holds their face during a difficult question, but how quickly their expression resets afterward. A person who is telling the truth under pressure tends to return to a relaxed baseline almost immediately once the question passes. The tension was situational, tied directly to the moment of being asked. A person who is managing something tends to hold residual tension well past the moment that provoked it, because the underlying issue hasn't actually resolved just because the question has moved on. The mask stays up a beat too long, because whatever it's covering is still there. The people who read others well are not the ones with the sharpest eyes for lies. They are the ones who understand that stillness under pressure is a performance like any other, and every performance leaves fingerprints on the performer. Learn to look for the fingerprints, not the face. And once you do, you will realize that the poker face was never really a wall at all. It was a window with the curtains only half drawn, and half is always enough, if you know how to look through the gap. There is a professional context worth studying here, because certain fields train composure more deliberately than others, and studying how that training fails is instructive. Surgeons, pilots, and hostage negotiators are trained extensively to project calm regardless of internal state, precisely because panic in those professions can cost lives. And yet even among the most rigorously trained professionals, subtle tells persist: a slightly higher vocal pitch during a genuine emergency, a millisecond delay before a rehearsed phrase, a hand that finds something to hold onto that wasn't necessary a moment before. If composure leaks even from people trained for years specifically to prevent that leak, it should tell you something important. The leak is not a failure of skill. It is a structural feature of being human under pressure, one that cannot be fully trained away, only managed. This matters practically because it changes what you should be listening for. Stop expecting to catch someone in an obvious moment of collapse. That rarely happens with people who have any composure at all. Instead, expect to find the smaller, structural leak, the pause that's a beat too calculated, the stillness that's a touch too uniform, the answer that arrives with suspicious tidiness. These are not dramatic signs. They are quiet ones. But quiet signs, read consistently over time, tell you more about a person than any single dramatic outburst ever could, because outbursts are rare and these small leaks happen constantly, in nearly every conversation that matters. There is a cultural dimension to composure worth naming honestly, because what counts as a leak varies considerably depending on the norm someone was raised inside. In some cultural contexts, emotional restraint is trained from early childhood as a marker of maturity and respect, and what looks like unusual stillness to an outside observer may simply be baseline behavior for that person, carrying no hidden strain at all. In other contexts, emotional expressiveness is the norm, and unusual stillness would indeed signal something being managed. Reading composure accurately requires knowing, at least roughly, what a relaxed version of stillness looks like within someone's own cultural framework, not assuming that a single universal standard for normal applies equally to everyone you encounter. It also helps to understand the specific physiological cost of sustained composure, because this cost accumulates and eventually shows itself even in the most disciplined people. Maintaining a managed exterior for an extended period, through a difficult negotiation, a long uncomfortable meeting, an entire day of hiding a personal crisis, draws down a finite reserve of self-regulation. This is why people who have held themselves together admirably through a difficult conversation often become noticeably more irritable, withdrawn, or uncharacteristically clumsy shortly afterward, once the performance is no longer required. If you want to understand what a person was truly carrying during a composed performance, watch what happens in the minutes immediately after the pressure lifts. That aftermath is often more revealing than anything visible during the performance itself. Finally, apply this same generosity to yourself that you're learning to apply in reading others. You will never achieve a perfect poker face either, and that is not a failure, it is simply confirmation that you are human in the same way everyone else is. The goal of this chapter was never to teach you to become unreadable overnight. It was to teach you that no one else is unreadable either, no matter how convincingly they perform otherwise, and that the gap between the mask and the truth beneath it is where the real conversation has been happening the entire time. Chapter 2, Silence Speaks First. Before anyone says a word, they have already told you something. The way someone enters a room before they greet you. The length of the pause before they answer a question they didn't expect. The silence that follows an accusation, which is never neutral. It is either the silence of guilt gathering its story, or the silence of innocence too stunned to defend itself, and the two are not as easy to tell apart as people assume, but they are not impossible either. Most communication training focuses on words, what to say, how to phrase it, which words carry weight. But words are the part of communication people have the most control over. Silence is where control slips. A skilled liar can plan their sentences. Almost no one plans their silences. Pay attention to where silence falls in a conversation, not just that it exists. Silence before a question is answered is different from silence after it's answered. The first is processing, deciding what to say. The second is often regret, reconsidering what was just said. If someone answers quickly and then goes quiet, that quiet is worth more than the fast answer. It usually means the fast answer was rehearsed, and the silence afterward is the moment reality caught up with the performance. Silence also reveals hierarchy. Watch who is comfortable letting a silence sit in a room, and who rushes to fill it. The person who can hold silence without discomfort usually holds more power in that relationship, real or perceived. The person who cannot bear a pause is often the one seeking approval, validation, or safety from the silence being broken in their favor. Learn to sit inside silence yourself before you try to read it in others. Most people are so uncomfortable with quiet that they miss what it's telling them, because they're too busy planning how to end it. The next time a conversation goes quiet, resist the urge to fill it. Watch what the other person does with the space you leave open. That space is where the truth usually goes to stretch its legs. There is a particular kind of silence worth learning to distinguish from the rest, the silence of relief. When a difficult subject finally gets named after being avoided for a long time, there is often a brief quiet that follows, and it does not feel like tension at all. It feels like an exhale. Learning to recognize this silence matters, because it tells you that naming the hard thing was the right choice, even if the moment felt risky when you did it. Confusing this relieved silence with an awkward or hostile one is a common error, and it causes people to retreat from honest conversations they should have pushed through, simply because they misread the pause that followed their honesty. Cultural context matters here too, and it's worth naming directly rather than assuming universal rules. In some cultural and family contexts, comfortable silence is the norm, a sign of ease rather than tension, a space where people are not expected to perform constant verbal engagement to prove they are present. In others, particularly in certain professional or Western conversational norms, silence longer than a few seconds is read as awkward almost by default. Reading silence accurately requires knowing which unspoken rules the person in front of you was raised inside, because a silence that would be alarming in one context is simply normal breathing room in another. Never read silence in isolation from the culture that shaped the person producing it. Finally, learn to notice the silence you create in others, not just the silence they bring into a room. The way someone reacts to your own quiet, whether they relax into it or grow visibly anxious, tells you a great deal about how safe they feel with you specifically. Silence is not only something to interpret in others. It is also a tool, used well, that reveals how people respond to being given space rather than being filled up with your words. Some people bloom in that space. Others panic in it. Both reactions are information, and both are worth listening to as closely as anything spoken aloud. Consider the specific silence that follows a compliment, because it is one of the most quietly revealing pauses in ordinary conversation. Some people receive praise and let a brief, comfortable silence follow it, allowing the moment to simply land. Others rush immediately to deflect, "Oh, it was nothing, anyone could have done it," filling the silence almost defensively, as though praise left unanswered too long might become dangerous. This reflex often traces back to a deeper discomfort with being seen positively, sometimes rooted in an early environment where visibility, even positive visibility, carried some kind of risk. Watching how someone handles the silence after being complimented will tell you more about their relationship with their own worth than almost anything they could say about it directly. Silence in negotiation deserves its own particular attention, because it is one of the few tools available to every party regardless of formal power. A skilled negotiator often makes an offer and then says nothing further, letting the silence apply its own pressure, because the human instinct to fill silence with concession is remarkably strong and remarkably consistent across cultures and contexts. Recognizing this dynamic when it is being used on you, and recognizing when you can use it yourself, is a practical extension of everything this chapter has covered. The person who can comfortably outlast a silence in a negotiation is very often the person who ends up with better terms, not because they argued better, but because they simply didn't rush to speak first. Consider also the silence that surrounds grief specifically, because it operates by different rules than almost any other kind. A grieving person's silence is rarely an invitation to be filled with reassurance, advice, or even careful words at all. It is very often simply the sound of pain that hasn't yet found language, and doesn't need to. The instinct to rush in with comforting words during someone's grief is usually more about the discomfort of the person witnessing the silence than about what the grieving person actually needs in that moment. Learning to sit beside grief's silence without trying to resolve it, fix it, or fill it prematurely is one of the most important and most difficult applications of everything covered in this chapter, and one of the deepest gifts you can offer someone you care about. Finally, notice how silence functions differently across the arc of a single long relationship compared to a single conversation. Couples who have been together for decades often develop what researchers call companionable silence, long stretches of shared quiet that carry no anxiety at all, simply because the relationship has accumulated enough trust that neither person needs constant verbal reassurance that the connection is intact. Reaching this kind of silence with another person is not a sign that conversation has run dry. It is one of the clearest markers that a relationship has reached its deepest, most settled form. And finally, learn to distinguish comfortable silence between people who know each other well from the silence of strangers who haven't yet built the trust required to let a pause simply exist. The former is a sign of deep ease, two people who no longer need constant verbal reassurance that the connection between them is intact. The latter, in new relationships, is often simply what unfamiliarity sounds like, and shouldn't be mistaken for either coldness or depth. As with everything in reading people, silence means different things depending entirely on who is producing it, and the relationship it's being produced within. See Chapter 3, The Body Never Lies. Words can be edited before they leave the mouth. The body does not have that luxury, it reacts before the mind has finished deciding what story it wants to tell. This is why the body is the most honest narrator in any room, even when its owner is actively trying to deceive you. Watch the feet before you watch the face. Faces are trained early, children learn to smile on command before they learn to read. Feet are almost never trained, because almost no one thinks to manage them. Feet that point toward the exit during a conversation are telling you the truth the mouth is too polite to say. Feet that turn fully toward you, still and grounded, are telling you that whatever the mouth is saying, the body has nowhere else it would rather be. Watch the hands when the stakes rise. Open palms during explanation tend to signal an attempt at honesty, or at least an attempt to appear open. Hands that disappear, into pockets, behind a back, under a table, often accompany information being withheld, though not always dishonestly, sometimes it's simply discomfort. The skill is not memorizing a dictionary of gestures. It's noticing when a gesture changes. A person who has kept their hands visible for 20 minutes and suddenly hides them the moment a topic shifts has just told you, without a word, that the topic matters more than they want you to know. Watch the breath. Shallow, high breathing in the chest signals activated stress. Slow, low breathing signals regulation, whether that regulation is genuine calm or a controlled performance of it. Breath is difficult to fake convincingly for long, which is why interrogators, negotiators, and skilled observers of all kinds return to it again and again. If someone's words are steady but their breathing has quickened, believe the breath. None of these signals mean anything alone. A person crossing their arms might be cold, not closed off. The skill of reading the body is not spotting a single gesture, it's noticing clusters, and noticing change. One signal is noise. 3 signals moving together, appearing at the same moment a sensitive topic arises, is a pattern. Learn to read patterns, not poses, and the body will stop hiding anything from you at all. Establishing a baseline is the single most overlooked step in reading body language, and it is also the most important one. Before you can notice a meaningful shift, you have to know how someone behaves when nothing is wrong. Spend the first few minutes of any important conversation simply observing, not analyzing, how does this person naturally sit, gesture, and breathe when the subject is neutral. Only once you have that baseline does a change become meaningful. Without it, you are comparing a person's behavior to a generic idea of normal that may not apply to them at all, and you will misread naturally reserved people as dishonest and naturally expressive people as unstable, simply because you skipped the step of learning their personal default. Pay attention, too, to what the body does in moments of genuine positive emotion, not just stress, because reading people well is not only about detecting discomfort. Real enthusiasm tends to show up asymmetrically and slightly before the words that describe it. A genuine smile engages the muscles around the eyes, not just the mouth, and tends to arrive a beat before someone says something exciting rather than a beat after, when it's more likely to be a polite, delayed performance of interest. Genuine engagement leans the body forward, unconsciously, toward the source of interest. A performed enthusiasm tends to stay upright and posed, because the body isn't actually being pulled anywhere, it's being positioned. Finally, remember that the body's honesty cuts both ways. It will also tell you the truth about your own state, if you learn to notice it in yourself the same way you notice it in others. The tightness in your own shoulders during a difficult conversation, the shallow breath you didn't realize you'd been holding, the urge to cross your arms the moment a topic touches something sensitive, these are the same signals you are learning to read in other people, and they are happening in you constantly, whether you're paying attention or not. The discipline of reading bodies well begins with the discipline of noticing your own. Consider, too, how proximity and space function as their own form of body language, distinct from gesture but just as revealing. People instinctively regulate the physical distance they keep from others based on comfort, trust, and perceived threat, and this regulation happens largely below conscious awareness. A person who closes distance during a conversation is often signaling growing trust or investment. A person who steadily increases distance, even in small increments, a half step back, a slight lean away, is often communicating discomfort they haven't put into words yet, and may not even be fully aware of themselves. Learning to track distance over the course of a conversation, rather than treating it as a fixed starting condition, reveals a slow-motion version of the same truths a single gesture might reveal in an instant. Mirroring deserves particular attention as well, because it works in two directions simultaneously, as something to notice in others, and as something you can use deliberately yourself. People who feel a genuine connection tend to unconsciously mirror each other's posture, pace, and gesture over the course of a conversation, adopting similar positions without either person intending to. Noticing this natural mirroring happening between two people is a reliable sign of rapport. And noticing its absence, two people whose bodies remain stubbornly out of sync throughout an entire conversation, often signals a disconnect that neither party may have named aloud, but that both are likely feeling. There is also a physiological signal worth learning to recognize, involving the skin itself, that most people never think to watch for. Sudden, localized flushing, particularly around the neck and upper chest, is one of the most difficult stress responses to consciously suppress, because it is governed by the autonomic nervous system almost entirely outside voluntary control. Unlike a practiced facial expression or a managed tone of voice, this kind of flushing bypasses composure training entirely, which is exactly what makes it worth watching for in moments where someone's words and posture otherwise suggest complete calm. A sudden patch of color rising during an otherwise steady explanation is one of the most honest, least fakeable signals the body offers. Finally, remember that body language should always be weighed alongside context, energy level, and physical health, because assuming every stillness or restlessness carries emotional meaning ignores the many mundane explanations that are often the real cause. A person who seems unusually fidgety may simply be uncomfortable in their chair. A person who seems unusually still may simply be tired. The discipline this chapter asks for is not suspicion toward every physical signal, but curiosity, noticing, asking when appropriate, and holding your interpretation loosely enough to be corrected by a simpler, more human explanation. Finally, understand that reading the body is not a skill you apply only to strangers or adversaries. Some of its most valuable applications are in your closest relationships, where words have often become so routine that they carry less information than the body beneath them. A partner who says, "I'm fine," while their shoulders remain tense long after the words are spoken is telling you something their voice has learned, perhaps over years, not to say directly. Learning to notice this in the people you love most is not an act of suspicion. It is an act of attention, the same attention this entire book is asking you to bring to every relationship that matters. Chapter 4, Reading the Room Before You Enter It. By the time you say your first word in any room, the room has already decided things about you, and you, if you're paying attention, can already know things about it. Most people wait until they are inside a conversation to start reading it. By then, they've missed the first and most honest data, how the room behaved before it knew it was being watched. Enter a room a few seconds before you're expected to and observe how people are arranged when no one is performing for an audience yet. Who is standing near the door, ready to leave? Who has claimed the space closest to power, whether that's the head of the table or simply proximity to whoever is speaking? Who is alone by choice, and who is alone because no one has approached them? Seating and standing arrangements are rarely accidental. They are a map of alliances, hierarchies, and anxieties drawn without anyone realizing they've drawn it. Listen to the register of the room before you speak. Is the volume of conversation tense and clipped, or loose and overlapping? Tense rooms have shorter sentences and more interruptions. Relaxed rooms let people finish their thoughts. You can learn more about the emotional temperature of a meeting in the first 10 seconds of walking in, before anyone acknowledges you, than in the first 10 minutes of the meeting itself. Notice who reacts to your entrance and how. A slight straightening of posture signals respect or caution. A too quick, too bright greeting often signals nervousness about what your presence might mean for the conversation that was happening before you arrived. People rarely perform for someone who doesn't matter to the outcome. If someone performs for you, it tells you that you matter more than you may have realized. Reading a room is not about controlling it. It's about entering with information instead of assumptions. Most people walk into every room the same way, regardless of what that room is actually telling them. The people who read others well walk in differently every time, because no two rooms, and no two silences, are saying quite the same thing. Consider also the physical residue a room carries from whatever happened in it just before you arrived. A conference room where a difficult conversation has just ended will hold that tension in ways you can sense even if you weren't there for it: chairs pushed back at odd angles, papers left disordered, a stiffness in the posture of whoever stayed behind. Learning to read the aftermath of a room, not just its present moment, tells you what kind of conversation you are walking into the middle of, even if no one tells you directly. Watch, too, how a room reorganizes itself the moment someone new and significant walks in, not you, necessarily, but a third party. Does the energy of the room shift toward that person immediately, or does it continue as though nothing happened? This tells you not only about that person's standing, but about the room's own values, whether status is something this particular group defers to instinctively or something they've learned to resist performing for. A room that doesn't shift for a powerful entrance is often a room with its own quiet, internal culture of equality, whether formally stated or not. Finally, learn to read the exits as carefully as the entrances. How people leave a room often tells you more honestly how they felt about what happened inside it than how they arrived. A meeting that ends with people lingering, continuing side conversations, unwilling to fully disperse, was likely a room where something genuinely useful or connecting happened. A meeting that empties instantly, with people moving toward the door before the closing words have even finished, tells you the room was enduring something rather than engaging with it. The exit is the room's honest review of itself, delivered wordlessly, and almost no one thinks to read it. Digital rooms deserve their own attention here, because increasingly, the rooms we read are virtual, and the same underlying principles apply in altered form. Watch who joins a video call early and makes small talk versus who arrives at the exact starting second, saying nothing until required. Watch whose camera stays on throughout versus who turns it off the moment their direct participation isn't needed. Watch the timing of messages in a group chat, who responds instantly, who waits, who never responds until directly addressed. The architecture is different, but the underlying data about comfort, hierarchy, and investment is remarkably similar, once you learn to translate the same reading skills into a screen instead of a physical space. Consider also how a room's history with you specifically shapes what you're able to read in it. A room that has seen you succeed will greet you differently than a room that has only seen you struggle, and this isn't necessarily unfair, it's simply memory, operating the same way your own memory of past rooms shapes how you walk into new ones. Part of reading a room accurately is being honest about what that room already believes about you before you arrived, because that belief will color everything from the initial greeting to the seating arrangement to the tone people choose when they first address you. Pay attention, too, to the specific texture of a room immediately following an announcement of change, a reorganization, a new policy, unexpected news. Rooms in this particular state carry a distinct signature. Conversation clusters more tightly than usual, laughter arrives a beat quieter and more careful, and people tend to check each other's reactions more frequently than they check the source of the news itself. Learning to recognize this specific post-announcement texture allows you to walk into a room already knowing that whatever business you came to discuss will be happening against a backdrop of unprocessed uncertainty, and adjusting your approach accordingly rather than being caught off guard by a distraction you didn't anticipate. Finally, remember that rooms, like people, have their own baseline that must be learned before deviations from it mean anything. A conference room that is always slightly tense on Monday mornings is not necessarily in crisis. It may simply be exhibiting its ordinary Monday morning texture, which only becomes meaningful information once you've spent enough time in that particular room to know what its ordinary feels like. Reading rooms well, like reading people well, is ultimately a discipline of patient, repeated observation rather than a single clever glance at the door. And finally, recognize that the most skilled readers of rooms don't just observe passively, they use what they've read to adjust their own entrance deliberately. If a room reads as tense, a skilled reader doesn't necessarily walk in with the same energy they bring to a relaxed room, they calibrate. This is not about becoming a chameleon with no consistent identity of your own. It is about recognizing that the same message, delivered with the same words, lands entirely differently depending on the emotional weather of the room receiving it, and that reading the room before you enter it is only valuable if you're willing to let what you learn actually change how you show up inside it. Chapter 5: The Three Masks Everyone Wears. Everyone carries three faces into every interaction, whether they know it or not. The first is the mask they believe the room wants to see. The second is the mask they want the room to believe they are, the identity they're actively building and defending. The third is what's underneath both, the actual state they're in, largely involuntary, leaking around the edges of the other two. The mistake most people make is trying to identify one true self hiding behind a single false one, as if people are simply liars and truth-tellers. But almost no one is operating with only one mask. A nervous employee in a meeting may be wearing the mask of confidence the room expects, while also wearing the mask of competence they want to project to their boss, while underneath both, they are simply afraid of being wrong in front of people whose opinion matters to their future. To read someone accurately, you have to learn to separate these three layers instead of collapsing them into one judgment. Ask yourself, what does this person think is expected of them here? That's mask 1. What do they want people to conclude about them, beyond what's expected? That's mask 2. And what physical or emotional signals are leaking despite both of those efforts? That's the truth underneath. The gap between mask 1 and mask 2 often reveals ambition, the distance between what's required and what someone is reaching for beyond it. The gap between mask 2 and the leaking truth reveals fear, the distance between the identity someone is trying to build and the anxiety that they might not be able to hold it up. Once you learn to see all three layers at once, you stop asking the flat question, is this person lying to me, which is rarely the most useful question anyway. You start asking a better one, which version of themselves is this person trying to protect right now, and why does it need protecting? That question will teach you more about a person in one conversation than years of taking their words at face value ever could. It helps to understand that these three masks are not static across contexts. A person's masks in a boardroom are not the same masks they wear at a family dinner, even though the underlying truth beneath all three layers remains the same person. Someone who commands total authority at work may wear a mask of deference at home, not because they are dishonest in either setting, but because different rooms have taught them different survival strategies. Reading someone well across multiple contexts means noticing which mask changes and which parts of them stay constant, because the constants are usually closer to the truth than any single mask observed in isolation. Pay particular attention to mask 2, the identity someone is actively trying to build, because it is often the most revealing of the three and the least examined. People rarely construct an identity for a room at random. They build the mask they most wish were true, or the mask that would have protected them at some earlier point when they didn't have it. A person who works hard to appear endlessly unbothered by criticism is very often someone who was deeply wounded by criticism at some point when they had no defenses against it yet. The mask is not a lie so much as a monument, built carefully, over years, to a version of safety they once desperately needed and never quite stopped building toward. Reading the Three Masks is also an act of generosity, if done with the right intention. Recognizing that someone's coldness is mask 1 performing for a room that punishes warmth, or that someone's bravado is mask 2 compensating for a truth they're not ready to reveal, allows you to respond to the whole person rather than reacting only to the surface they've presented. This does not mean excusing harmful behavior because you understand its roots. It means responding with accuracy instead of assumption, treating the mask as information about someone's history, not as the final word on their character. There is a particular version of this framework worth applying to yourself, honestly, before applying it further to others. Sit with the question of what your own 3 masks look like in the rooms that matter most to you, what you believe is expected of you there, what identity you're actively trying to build in that specific context, and what's actually true underneath both layers when no one, including you, is managing the performance. Most people have never asked themselves this question directly, and the exercise alone tends to be clarifying in a way that reading others rarely is, because you have access to information about your own third layer that no observer, however skilled, could ever fully see from outside. Watch, too, how masks shift under sustained pressure rather than momentary stress, because the two produce different effects. A brief stressful moment tends to make mask 2, the identity someone is actively defending, more rigid, more insistent, as the person works harder to hold the performance together. Sustained pressure over weeks or months, by contrast, often exhausts the capacity to maintain mask 2 at all, and what emerges instead is a strange, unguarded version of the third layer, visible not because the person chose to reveal it but because they no longer had the resources to keep hiding it. This is one of the reasons people often seem most fundamentally themselves during genuinely difficult, prolonged periods, not because hardship reveals character in some poetic sense, but because hardship simply depletes the energy required to keep performing anything else. Consider how mask 1, the identity a room expects, differs meaningfully depending on the specific room in question, and how tracking a person across multiple rooms reveals information no single room could offer alone. The version of a colleague you see in a formal client meeting, tightly controlled and diplomatically careful, may look almost unrecognizable next to the version you glimpse making a joke with a junior teammate in the hallway. Neither version is more real than the other, both are genuine responses to genuinely different rooms. What matters is noticing the range between them, because the width of that range tells you something about how much this particular person's presentation is shaped by context versus how much of them stays constant no matter where they stand. Finally, understand that people who have done real internal work on themselves tend to show a narrower gap between all 3 masks over time, not because they've become simpler, but because they've become more integrated, less need to perform an identity that differs sharply from what's actually true underneath. Watching someone's gap between masks narrow over the course of knowing them, particularly after a period of genuine personal growth or therapy, is one of the quiet, hopeful things this framework allows you to notice, if you're paying attention closely enough and long enough to see it happen. Finally, remember that everyone you read through this framework is also, somewhere, reading you the same way, noticing your masks, wondering about the gap between what you present and what you protect. This mutual, largely unspoken awareness is part of what makes deep relationships different from surface ones. In the relationships that matter most, both people eventually stop needing masks 1 and 2 with each other entirely, not because the masks disappear from the rest of their lives, but because they've built something rare, a room where the third layer no longer needs defending. Chapter 6, What People Repeat, They Reveal. Pay attention to what a person says more than once in a single conversation, especially if you didn't ask them to repeat it. Repetition is rarely accidental. When someone circles back to the same phrase, the same justification, the same small detail, they are often trying to convince someone, and it isn't always you. There is a difference between repetition used for emphasis and repetition used for reassurance. Emphasis repeats a point to make sure it lands with the listener. Reassurance repeats a point to make sure it lands with the speaker. The tell is in the tone. Emphasis tends to grow more confident with each repetition. Reassurance tends to grow more insistent, sometimes even irritated, as though the words are being asked to do work they aren't quite strong enough to do. Listen for the phrases people reach for under pressure. To be honest with you often precedes something the speaker is aware could sound dishonest. I'm not the kind of person who is frequently said by someone defending against an accusation no one has made yet, which tells you they've made it to themselves already. These aren't universal rules, they're patterns worth testing against the specific person in front of you, because everyone has their own verbal tics under stress, and the skill is in learning an individual's baseline, not applying a script to everyone equally. The same applies to stories people tell about themselves. A person who repeatedly brings up a particular success, unprompted, across multiple conversations, is often not bragging, they are trying to settle a private account with an old doubt. A person who repeatedly minimizes their own achievements is often not being humble, they are preempting a criticism they expect and would rather deliver themselves. To read what someone repeats is to read what someone is still working out. People don't usually repeat things they've fully made peace with. They repeat the things still under negotiation inside them. Listen for the loop, and you'll find the wound, or the wish, sitting quietly underneath it. Repetition also shows up across time, not just within a single conversation, and this longer-range pattern is often even more revealing than anything said in one sitting. A person who, across months of knowing them, keeps returning to the same story about being overlooked at work is telling you something about a wound that hasn't healed, regardless of how many times they insist they're over it. A person who consistently brings the conversation back to a particular fear, dressed up in different topics each time, is showing you the fear underneath the topics, the actual subject they're circling, using whatever surface conversation happens to be available as a vehicle to get there. It's worth distinguishing repetition from mere habit, because not every repeated phrase carries emotional weight. Some people simply have verbal patterns that mean nothing beyond personal style. The distinguishing factor is context sensitivity. A habitual phrase appears regardless of subject matter, flatly, in low-stakes and high-stakes moments alike. A meaningful repetition appears selectively, clustering specifically around certain topics or certain kinds of pressure, and disappearing during neutral conversation. Learn to notice where the repetition concentrates, not just that it exists, and you'll be able to separate the verbal tics that mean nothing from the loops that mean everything. Finally, listen for what a group repeats collectively, not just what individuals repeat. Teams, families, and friend groups often develop shared phrases that function as a kind of protective folklore. A family that repeatedly jokes about a certain relative's temper is often using humor to manage a tension no one wants to name directly. A team that repeatedly jokes about being too honest with each other may be signaling, indirectly, that honesty in that group actually carries real risk. Collective repetition is a map of a group's unspoken rules, written in the language of things everyone finds safe enough to say out loud, over and over, instead of the harder thing underneath that no one has said even once. There is also a version of repetition worth watching for in what people consistently avoid saying, which functions almost as a photographic negative of everything discussed so far. A topic that reliably gets deflected with humor, or redirected towards something else the moment it arises, is often carrying more weight than a topic someone repeats directly, precisely because it has never been allowed to surface long enough to be named. Two people at a dinner table who always, reliably, change the subject the moment a certain relative or a certain past event comes up are repeating something too, an agreement, likely never spoken aloud, that this particular subject does not get discussed here. Learning to notice the shape of a conversational avoidance, repeated consistently across contexts, is simply repetition read in reverse. Consider, too, how repetition changes as trust deepens in a relationship over time, and how tracking that change can tell you something valuable about the relationship's trajectory. A story someone told guardedly and briefly early in a friendship, if it resurfaces later told with more detail, more vulnerability, and less defensiveness, is showing you that trust has genuinely grown. The story hasn't changed, but the teller's relationship to telling it has. Conversely, a story that grows more guarded and abbreviated over time, told with less detail than it once carried, may be showing you a relationship that has quietly lost some of the safety it once had, even if nothing dramatic ever happened to explain the shift. There is also a particular category of repetition worth watching for in professional settings, the phrase or justification a team repeats collectively whenever a particular kind of decision comes up. A company culture that repeatedly explains difficult layoffs as necessary for the health of the business, without variation, meeting after meeting, is revealing something about how that organization has learned to metabolize guilt collectively. Listening for a team's shared vocabulary around its most difficult decisions often tells an outside observer more about the actual culture of an organization than any mission statement or stated value ever could, because the repeated phrase is doing real emotional labor the mission statement was never asked to do. Finally, notice what happens when you gently name a pattern of repetition back to someone, with care, and how they respond to being shown it. Some people receive this kind of reflection with genuine curiosity, grateful to have something surfaced they hadn't consciously noticed about themselves. Others respond defensively, as though being shown their own pattern feels like exposure rather than insight. Neither reaction is necessarily wrong, but the difference tells you something about how ready that particular person is, in that particular moment, to look honestly at the thing they keep circling. Finally, hold this entire chapter with appropriate humility. Not every repeated phrase is a window into someone's psyche, and treating casual conversational habits as profound revelations will make you both exhausting and frequently wrong. The skill lies in proportion, noticing repetition that clusters meaningfully around emotionally significant topics, while letting ordinary verbal habits simply be what they usually are, the harmless texture of how a particular person happens to talk. Chapter 7: The Pause Before the Lie. Not every pause means dishonesty, and treating every hesitation as a red flag is one of the fastest ways to misread someone. But there is a particular kind of pause worth learning to recognize, the pause of construction, where someone is not remembering an answer but building one. Genuine recall has a different rhythm than invention. When people remember something true, they tend to retrieve it with small imperfections, a correction mid-sentence, a detail out of order that gets fixed, and, oh wait, actually, that interrupts the flow. Memory is messy because real events are messy. When people construct something false, the story often arrives too clean, too linear, with the details arranged in an order that makes narrative sense rather than the disordered way memory actually retrieves things. The pause before a lie is frequently longer than the pause before a memory, because construction takes more cognitive effort than retrieval. But length alone isn't the tell. Plenty of honest people pause long because a question caught them off guard, or because the truth is complicated. What matters more is what happens during the pause. Does the person's eyes move as if searching, often associated with recall, or does their body still completely, as if concentrating on getting something right? Watch what happens immediately after the pause ends, too. A true answer, once it starts, tends to keep flowing, one detail leads naturally to another. A constructed answer often stalls again quickly, needing a second pause shortly after the first, because the story wasn't fully built before it started being told. None of this makes you a lie detector, no single behavior does, and anyone who claims certainty from body language alone is overselling their skill. What this makes you is someone who listens to the shape of an answer, not just its content. And the shape of a true story and a built one are rarely identical, if you're patient enough to notice the difference. Consider, too, the level of unnecessary detail in an answer as another signal worth weighing alongside the pause itself. Genuine memories often include small, irrelevant, almost boring details, the specific weather that day, an unrelated interruption, a detail that adds nothing to the point being made but happens to be true. Constructed stories tend to be leaner, containing only the details that serve the narrative, because inventing irrelevant specifics on the spot is cognitively expensive and most people under pressure don't bother. A story that feels a little too tidy, a little too on message, deserves a second look, not automatic suspicion, but genuine curiosity about whether it was retrieved or built. Watch also for what happens when you ask a follow-up question that wasn't anticipated. True memories tend to expand easily under follow-up, a person can usually add more real detail because the underlying event actually happened and contains far more information than they initially shared. Constructed stories often struggle with unexpected follow-ups, because the story was built to answer the expected question, not to withstand examination from an angle the speaker didn't prepare for. If someone's story gets noticeably thinner or vaguer the moment you ask something they didn't see coming, that thinning is worth noting, not as proof, but as a thread worth gently pulling on, if the stakes of the conversation warrant it. It is worth saying plainly, as a caution, this chapter is not permission to interrogate everyone you speak with, and treating every pause as suspicious will make you exhausting to be around and inaccurate in your conclusions besides. These tools are for moments that matter, genuine ambiguity in high-stakes situations, not for auditing every hesitation in ordinary conversation. Read with care, and remember that most silence, most pauses, and most imperfect stories are simply what honesty sounds like when a person hasn't rehearsed it. It is also worth understanding why these signals exist at all, because the underlying mechanism makes them more trustworthy than a simple list of behaviors to watch for. Constructing a false narrative and holding it consistently under questioning is genuinely cognitively demanding. The brain must invent details, keep them internally consistent, monitor the listener's reaction, and suppress the actual truth simultaneously, all while appearing relaxed. This is an enormous amount of simultaneous processing, and it is why deception, sustained over a long or detailed conversation, tends to produce cracks somewhere, even in practiced people. Recall, by contrast, requires none of this parallel effort. The brain simply retrieves what happened, with all its natural imperfection intact. Understanding this mechanism, rather than memorizing a checklist of tells, will make you far more adaptable when you encounter someone whose particular pattern doesn't match the common examples exactly. Consider also how stakes change the reliability of these signals considerably. In low-stakes contexts, a white lie about liking a gift, a polite exaggeration about being busy, the cognitive load of invention is minimal, and the tells described in this chapter may barely register at all, because there's simply not enough at risk to produce meaningful strain. These signals become most reliable precisely in the moments they matter most, when something significant is being protected, when the consequences of being caught are real, and when the story being told carries genuine weight for the person telling it. Save your closest attention for these higher-stakes moments, and extend more natural generosity toward the countless small, low-stakes untruths that smooth ordinary social life without doing anyone real harm. It's also worth understanding how practiced deception changes these signals over time, because someone who has told the same false story many times has, in effect, converted invention into something closer to memory through sheer repetition. The first telling of a lie tends to show the most strain. The 50th telling of the same lie may show almost none, because the brain has effectively encoded the false story the same way it encodes anything rehearsed extensively. This is precisely why long-practiced deceptions are so much harder to catch than spontaneous ones, and why the most reliable moments for detecting dishonesty are often the first time a story is told, or the first time it's challenged with a question the teller hasn't had to answer before. Finally, hold all of this alongside a broader truth about human communication. Most people, most of the time, are telling the truth as they understand it, even when that truth is incomplete, self-serving, or shaped by their own blind spots. The tools in this chapter are for the genuine exceptions, the moments that matter, where real deception is plausible and the stakes justify closer attention, not a lens to apply by default to everyone you speak with. Trust remains the reasonable starting position with most people, most of the time, and these tools exist to sharpen your judgment in the moments that reasonably call for it. Finally, remember that even a well-founded suspicion, correctly read, does not obligate you to act on it immediately or dramatically. Sometimes the most useful thing to do with an accurate read of hesitation is simply to note it privately and continue gathering information, rather than confronting the moment it appears. Patience, paired with accurate observation, will serve you better in nearly every important situation than swift accusation ever could, because a pattern confirmed over time is far more reliable evidence than a single pause, however suspicious it felt in the moment. Chapter 8, Reading Power Without Words. Power rarely announces itself. The person who dominates a room by volume is often not the person who actually holds the power in it. Real power tends to be quieter, because it doesn't need to prove itself moment to moment, it has already been established, and everyone in the room already knows it. Watch where eyes go after someone speaks. In most groups, when a decision needs to be made, people unconsciously glance toward whoever's approval actually matters, not necessarily the person with the highest title, but the person whose reaction determines what happens next. That glance is a more reliable map of real influence than any org chart. Watch who apologizes for taking up space, and who doesn't think to. People with less perceived power tend to preface their contributions with soft language. This might be a silly question, I could be wrong, but. People with more perceived power tend to state their views plainly, because they haven't learned to expect pushback the way others have. This isn't a moral judgment about either group, it's a pattern shaped by experience, and it's a reliable signal of how safe someone feels in a given room. Watch interruptions carefully. Not all interruptions are equal. An interruption that gets absorbed smoothly, without protest, tells you something about whose voice is expected to yield in that space. An interruption that gets pushed back against tells you the interrupted person believes their standing gives them the right to finish. Power also reveals itself in what a person does not have to explain. The less someone has to justify their presence, their opinion, or their decisions, the more real power they likely hold in that context. Justification is often a tax paid by those still proving they belong. Learning to read power without words means learning to watch the room's unconscious choreography, who defers, who is deferred to, who speaks last and settles the matter, and who speaks first simply to be heard. Titles are printed on business cards. Power is performed, quietly, in every exchange that doesn't require a title to explain it. There is a particular signal worth training yourself to notice: who in the room is allowed to change the subject. In most groups, only certain people have the unspoken social permission to redirect a conversation without it feeling like a violation of the flow. Watch for the moment a topic shifts and notice who initiated it, and whether the room simply follows without resistance. The ability to redirect a group's attention without needing to ask permission first is one of the purest, least noticed signals of standing in any room. Watch, too, how power responds to being questioned, because this reveals something deeper than mere hierarchy. It reveals how secure that power actually is. Genuinely secure power tends to welcome challenge with curiosity, because it isn't threatened by disagreement, it has enough standing to survive being wrong occasionally. Insecure power, even when it occupies a high position, tends to respond to challenge with disproportionate defensiveness, because the position is being held together by the appearance of infallibility rather than a genuine sense of safety. Learning to distinguish secure power from performed power will save you from either deferring too much to people who don't deserve it, or challenging people whose reaction will cost you more than the challenge was worth. Finally, pay attention to how power moves during moments of crisis rather than moments of calm, because crisis is where performed hierarchies tend to collapse and real ones tend to emerge. The person everyone turns to when things go wrong, rather than the person whose name is on the door, is very often the actual center of gravity in an organization or family, regardless of what any formal chart claims. Reading power accurately means watching not just who holds the microphone during ordinary moments, but who the room instinctively turns toward when the ground shifts beneath it. Consider also how power reveals itself through the pacing of a conversation, not just its content. People with genuine standing in a room often speak more slowly than those still working to establish themselves, because speed frequently signals a need to get a point in before it can be interrupted or dismissed, an anxiety about airtime that secure power simply doesn't carry. Watch for who feels entitled to pause mid-sentence, take their time, and trust that the room will wait for them to finish the thought. That entitlement to unhurried speech, more than volume or word choice, is one of the most consistent markers of genuine standing across nearly every group setting. There is a particularly useful signal in how power responds to good news versus bad news, worth training yourself to notice specifically. Secure power tends to share credit generously when things go well, because it isn't threatened by others receiving recognition, there's enough standing to spare. Insecure power, occupying a position without the underlying security to match it, often manages credit far more carefully, redirecting praise toward itself even in situations where sharing it would cost nothing. Watching how someone handles a genuinely good outcome, not just a difficult one, often reveals as much about the true nature of their power as watching them handle a crisis. Watch also for the specific tell of how someone treats the person serving them in a room, a waiter, an assistant, a junior employee handling logistics, because this single behavior, more than almost anything said directly to you, reveals character with startling reliability. People navigating a room strategically often reserve their warmth for those whose opinion they believe matters and treat those they perceive as having no power to affect them with visible indifference or impatience. This asymmetry, easy to miss if you're only watching how someone treats you, becomes impossible to miss once you start watching how they treat everyone else in the room simultaneously. Finally, understand that power itself is not a fixed trait but a relationship, constantly renegotiated by every interaction that either reinforces or challenges it. The org chart captures a snapshot, frozen at the moment it was drawn, but real power in any ongoing relationship or organization shifts continuously based on outcomes, alliances, and trust built or spent along the way. Reading power well means treating it the same way this book has asked you to treat everything else worth reading, not as a fixed label applied once, but as a pattern requiring ongoing, patient observation to stay accurate. Finally, remember that power, read accurately, is not something to simply defer to or resent. It is information to be used wisely. Knowing who actually holds influence in a given room allows you to communicate more effectively, to anticipate how decisions will actually get made rather than how the org chart suggests they should, and to build genuine relationships with the people whose support will matter most when it counts. This is not about flattery or manipulation. It is about seeing clearly enough to navigate any room with the accuracy it deserves, rather than the assumptions a formal title alone would suggest. Chapter 9: The Currency of Attention. Attention is the most honest currency people spend, because unlike words, it is very difficult to fake convincingly over time. Where someone's focus goes when they think no one is measuring it will tell you more about their priorities than anything they'd claim their priorities to be. Watch what people look at when they think a conversation has moved past the interesting part. A person whose eyes drift to their phone, the door, or another conversation the moment a topic no longer serves them is telling you, plainly, what they were actually there for. A person whose attention stays locked even through a boring stretch is telling you something rarer, that their interest is in the person, not just the immediate value of the exchange. Watch how quickly someone re-engages after a distraction. Attention that snaps back instantly when their name is mentioned, even mid-distraction, tells you they were still partially tracking the conversation despite appearances, a sign of social skill, not necessarily dishonesty. Attention that takes a long beat to return tells you they had genuinely checked out, and are now working to catch up. Attention also reveals what someone fears losing. People tend to watch most closely the things they are least secure about keeping. A partner watches a rival closely not because of confidence, but because of doubt. An employee watches a new hire closely not out of curiosity, but out of concern for their own position. Where anxious attention goes is often a map of where someone feels most vulnerable. Learn to notice not just what people say is important to them, but what actually earns their unclaimed attention, the moments when no one is asking them to pay attention to anything in particular, and they choose to anyway. That unclaimed attention is rarely political. It's usually the truest indicator of what someone actually values, stripped of the performance of what they believe they should value. There is a distinction worth making between attention given and attention held, because the two are measured differently and reveal different things. Attention given is what someone offers when asked directly, eye contact during a question, nodding during an explanation. It can be performed relatively easily, and most socially competent people are quite good at faking it when required. Attention held is what happens in the gaps, the moments between prompts, when no one has asked for anything and a person's focus simply reveals where it naturally wants to rest. Attention held is far harder to fake, and far more honest, because it isn't being managed for an audience. Notice also how attention shifts the moment stakes rise for the person you're watching, not just for you. A person deeply focused on you during small talk may become visibly distracted the instant a topic touches something with real consequences for them, a mention of a competitor, a reference to a decision they haven't made yet, a name connected to unresolved tension. This kind of attentional flinch, where focus visibly narrows or scatters at a specific trigger, is one of the most reliable maps of where someone's genuine concerns live, because it happens involuntarily, faster than any conscious management of the reaction. Finally, treat your own attention as a signal worth managing deliberately, not just something to read in others. The people who feel most valued in your life are, almost without exception, the people to whom you have given the most unclaimed attention, not performative attention offered because it was expected, but the quiet, chosen kind that shows up in the moments no one was measuring. If reading people is a skill you want to build for the sake of understanding others more deeply, remember that the same currency works both directions, and the attention you spend is telling everyone around you, constantly, exactly what and who you value most. There is a particular reading worth developing around divided attention, since most modern conversations happen alongside some degree of competing demand, a phone within reach, a task left unfinished, a background thought the person hasn't set down. The question worth asking isn't whether someone's attention is divided at all, because almost everyone's is to some extent in daily life. The question is what they do at the moment a choice presents itself between the competing demands. A person who silences a notification without looking, mid-conversation, in order to keep their focus on you, is making a small but real choice about where their attention belongs in that instant. A person who glances at every buzz, even briefly, is making a different choice, whether or not they'd admit to it consciously. Watch, too, for the specific quality of attention people give to details that don't obviously matter to them, the name of your coworker mentioned once in passing, a small preference you stated weeks ago, an offhand comment about a difficult day. People with genuinely deep attention toward you tend to retain and later reference these small, seemingly unimportant details, not because they're trying to impress you, but because their attention was actually engaged enough at the time to encode the information in the first place. This kind of retained, unprompted detail is one of the most reliable signs of real investment, because it cannot be performed convincingly after the fact. Either the attention was there when it mattered, or the detail simply isn't available to recall later. Consider also the specific attention a person gives to your absence, not just your presence, whether they follow up after you've missed an event, notice a change in your routine, or ask about something you mentioned would be happening while they weren't around to see it directly. This kind of attention across a gap, sustained without the other person physically present to prompt it, is a rarer and often more meaningful signal than attention given in the room, because it requires the other person to have been thinking of you when nothing was actively demanding that they do so. Finally, be honest with yourself about how you spend your own attention across the people in your life, because this chapter's lessons apply as a mirror at least as much as a lens turned outward. If reading people has taught you anything by this point in the book, let it be this: the relationships that thrive are rarely the ones with the most dramatic declarations of importance. They are the ones sustained by consistent, unclaimed, unglamorous attention, given quietly and often, long before anyone thought to measure it. Finally, understand that attention, like trust, operates on a kind of ledger over time, and a single distracted moment should not be read as a verdict on someone's overall regard for you, any more than a single kept promise should be read as complete proof of someone's reliability. Attention deserves the same patient, pattern-based reading this book has applied to every other signal, watched consistently, over many moments, rather than judged harshly from any single instance of a phone glanced at or a thought that briefly wandered elsewhere. Chapter 10: Emotional Weather Systems. People don't usually arrive at a single emotion and stay there. Emotional states move like weather, they build, shift, and pass, often influenced by systems the person themselves isn't fully tracking. Reading someone well means reading their weather pattern, not just the emotion sitting on the surface at any given moment. Ask yourself, when reading someone's mood, not just what are they feeling, but what is this feeling in response to, and is it about me at all? A large percentage of the emotional weather people bring into a room has nothing to do with the room itself, it was generated somewhere else and carried in, unresolved. Misreading someone's weather as being about you is one of the most common errors in reading people, and one of the most costly, because it leads to responses calibrated to the wrong cause entirely. Notice the difference between a mood and a mode. A mood is temporary and reactive, irritability after a bad commute, warmth after good news. A mode is a more stable operating pattern, a person who is generally anxious, generally guarded, generally optimistic, regardless of the day's specific events. Reading someone accurately requires distinguishing their baseline mode from a passing mood layered on top of it. What looks like sudden coldness might just be a bad mood moving through a warm mode. What looks like sudden warmth might be a good mood moving briefly through a guarded one, and worth noticing precisely because it's rare. Track emotional weather over time, not just in a single snapshot. A person who is short with you once is having a moment. A person who is consistently short with you across many different contexts and days is showing you their mode. Confusing the two, treating a single storm as a permanent climate, or a permanent climate as just one passing storm, leads to some of the worst misjudgments people make about each other. The people who read emotional weather well are patient enough to watch for pattern before drawing conclusions. They resist the urge to diagnose someone from a single data point, because they understand that everyone, including themselves, has bad weather sometimes that says nothing lasting about the climate underneath. It's worth developing a working sense of a person's emotional forecast, not just their current conditions. Certain seasons in a person's life, a stressful project at work, a health concern in their family, an anniversary of a loss, tend to shift their weather predictably, the way certain seasons shift actual climate. Knowing what season someone is currently moving through, even without asking directly, allows you to interpret an unexpected storm with far more accuracy than reading it as a mystery arriving from nowhere. Most emotional weather has a traceable source, even when the person experiencing it hasn't fully named it to themselves yet. Pay attention also to how someone's weather responds to your own. Emotional states are contagious in ways most people underestimate. A tense person entering a calm room will often either absorb the calm or infect it with their tension, and which of those two things happens tells you something important about the relative emotional strength of the room versus the individual. Watching whether someone's storm dissipates in your presence, or whether your own calm gets pulled into their turbulence instead, is a quiet but powerful measure of the emotional dynamic between you, and worth noticing in every significant relationship you have, professional or personal. Finally, remember that reading someone's emotional weather accurately is only the first half of the skill. The second half is choosing how to respond to it with care rather than reaction. Recognizing that someone's coldness is weather passing through, not climate, gives you the option to meet it with patience instead of matching it with coldness of your own. This is not about excusing genuinely harmful behavior, which deserves boundaries regardless of its source. It is about the vast majority of ordinary friction in relationships, most of which is weather, not character, and treating it as character, permanently, is one of the surest ways to turn a passing storm into a lasting one. Consider how physical states quietly shape emotional weather in ways people rarely credit accurately. Hunger, poor sleep, and physical pain all lower a person's capacity for patience and warmth, producing what looks like a character shift but is often simply biology asking to be addressed. Learning to ask, gently, whether someone has eaten or slept before assuming their coldness reflects something deeper about the relationship is not a trivial courtesy. It is often the single most accurate diagnostic available, because so much of what gets read as emotional significance is, underneath, simply an unmet physical need wearing an emotional costume. There is also a generational and seasonal weather pattern worth tracking in long-term relationships specifically. Certain times of year, certain anniversaries, certain recurring obligations reliably bring the same emotional weather back around, year after year, even when the person experiencing it hasn't consciously connected the dots. A person who grows withdrawn every autumn, or anxious every time a particular holiday approaches, is often responding to an emotional season with roots the calendar itself can help explain, even without a single word of explanation offered. Learning someone's seasonal patterns over years of knowing them is one of the deepest forms of reading this book describes, because it requires patience measured not in conversations but in years. Watch, too, for the specific weather pattern that follows major life transitions, even positive ones, because emotional weather doesn't discriminate between wanted and unwanted change, both produce genuine disruption to a person's internal equilibrium. A new job, a wedding, a long-awaited promotion can all produce turbulent weather that looks, from the outside, confusingly inconsistent with the good news itself. Understanding that even positive transitions carry real emotional cost allows you to read apparent moodiness after good news accurately, rather than mistaking it for ingratitude or a character flaw. Finally, learn to distinguish weather that clears on its own from weather that requires active intervention. Most emotional storms genuinely do pass with time, patience, and ordinary support. But some weather patterns, particularly those that persist for months without any lightning, cross into territory that benefits from professional support rather than simply patient waiting. Recognizing this distinction, knowing when to simply weather the storm alongside someone, and when to gently encourage them toward more structured help, is one of the most caring applications of everything this chapter has taught you. Finally, extend to yourself the same weather-reading generosity you're learning to extend to others. Your own bad days are weather, not a referendum on your character, and treating your own passing storms as permanent truths about who you are is exactly the same error this chapter has been warning against in how you read other people. The self-compassion this requires is not indulgence. It is simply accuracy, applied evenly, to the person you understand best and are often hardest on, yourself. Chapter 10, Emotional Weather Systems. People don't usually arrive at a single emotion and stay there. Emotional states move like weather, they build, shift, and pass, often influenced by systems the person themselves isn't fully tracking. Reading someone well means reading their weather pattern, not just the emotion sitting on the surface at any given moment. Ask yourself, when reading someone's mood, not just what are they feeling, but what is this feeling in response to, and is it about me at all? A large percentage of the emotional weather people bring into a room has nothing to do with the room itself, it was generated somewhere else and carried in, unresolved. Misreading someone's weather as being about you is one of the most common errors in reading people, and one of the most costly, because it leads to responses calibrated to the wrong cause entirely. Notice the difference between a mood and a mode. A mood is temporary and reactive, irritability after a bad commute, warmth after good news. A mode is a more stable operating pattern, a person who is generally anxious, generally guarded, generally optimistic, regardless of the day's specific events. Reading someone accurately requires distinguishing their baseline mode from a passing mood layered on top of it. What looks like sudden coldness might just be a bad mood moving through a warm mode. What looks like sudden warmth might be a good mood moving briefly through a guarded one, and worth noticing precisely because it's rare. Track emotional weather over time, not just in a single snapshot. A person who is short with you once is having a moment. A person who is consistently short with you across many different contexts and days is showing you their mode. Confusing the two, treating a single storm as a permanent climate, or a permanent climate as just one passing storm, leads to some of the worst misjudgments people make about each other. The people who read emotional weather well are patient enough to watch for pattern before drawing conclusions. They resist the urge to diagnose someone from a single data point, because they understand that everyone, including themselves, has bad weather sometimes that says nothing lasting about the climate underneath. It's worth developing a working sense of a person's emotional forecast, not just their current conditions. Certain seasons in a person's life, a stressful project at work, a health concern in their family, an anniversary of a loss, tend to shift their weather predictably, the way certain seasons shift actual climate. Knowing what season someone is currently moving through, even without asking directly, allows you to interpret an unexpected storm with far more accuracy than reading it as a mystery arriving from nowhere. Most emotional weather has a traceable source, even when the person experiencing it hasn't fully named it to themselves yet. Pay attention also to how someone's weather responds to your own. Emotional states are contagious in ways most people underestimate. A tense person entering a calm room will often either absorb the calm or infect it with their tension, and which of those two things happens tells you something important about the relative emotional strength of the room versus the individual. Watching whether someone's storm dissipates in your presence, or whether your own calm gets pulled into their turbulence instead, is a quiet but powerful measure of the emotional dynamic between you, and worth noticing in every significant relationship you have, professional or personal. Finally, remember that reading someone's emotional weather accurately is only the first half of the skill. The second half is choosing how to respond to it with care rather than reaction. Recognizing that someone's coldness is weather passing through, not climate, gives you the option to meet it with patience instead of matching it with coldness of your own. This is not about excusing genuinely harmful behavior, which deserves boundaries regardless of its source. It is about the vast majority of ordinary friction in relationships, most of which is weather, not character, and treating it as character, permanently, is one of the surest ways to turn a passing storm into a lasting one. Consider how physical states quietly shape emotional weather in ways people rarely credit accurately. Hunger, poor sleep, and physical pain all lower a person's capacity for patience and warmth, producing what looks like a character shift but is often simply biology asking to be addressed. Learning to ask, gently, whether someone has eaten or slept before assuming their coldness reflects something deeper about the relationship is not a trivial courtesy. It is often the single most accurate diagnostic available, because so much of what gets read as emotional significance is, underneath, simply an unmet physical need wearing an emotional costume. There is also a generational and seasonal weather pattern worth tracking in long-term relationships specifically. Certain times of year, certain anniversaries, certain recurring obligations reliably bring the same emotional weather back around, year after year, even when the person experiencing it hasn't consciously connected the dots. A person who grows withdrawn every autumn, or anxious every time a particular holiday approaches, is often responding to an emotional season with roots the calendar itself can help explain, even without a single word of explanation offered. Learning someone's seasonal patterns over years of knowing them is one of the deepest forms of reading this book describes, because it requires patience measured not in conversations but in years. Watch, too, for the specific weather pattern that follows major life transitions, even positive ones, because emotional weather doesn't discriminate between wanted and unwanted change, both produce genuine disruption to a person's internal equilibrium. A new job, a wedding, a long-awaited promotion can all produce turbulent weather that looks, from the outside, confusingly inconsistent with the good news itself. Understanding that even positive transitions carry real emotional cost allows you to read apparent moodiness after good news accurately, rather than mistaking it for ingratitude or a character flaw. Finally, learn to distinguish weather that clears on its own from weather that requires active intervention. Most emotional storms genuinely do pass with time, patience, and ordinary support. But some weather patterns, particularly those that persist for months without any lightning, cross into territory that benefits from professional support rather than simply patient waiting. Recognizing this distinction, knowing when to simply weather the storm alongside someone, and when to gently encourage them toward more structured help, is one of the most caring applications of everything this chapter has taught you. Finally, extend to yourself the same weather-reading generosity you're learning to extend to others. Your own bad days are weather, not a referendum on your character, and treating your own passing storms as permanent truths about who you are is exactly the same error this chapter has been warning against in how you read other people. The self-compassion this requires is not indulgence. It is simply accuracy, applied evenly, to the person you understand best and are often hardest on, yourself. Chapter 11, The Architecture of Trust. Trust is not built the way people think it is, through grand gestures or single dramatic proofs. It is built architecturally, in small load-bearing moments most people don't notice happening, and it is those small moments, not the big ones, that determine whether a structure holds weight when it's tested. Watch how someone handles small commitments, not large ones. A person who says they'll call back at 3 p.m. and calls at 3:02 is showing you more about their reliability than any speech about loyalty ever could. Small promises kept consistently build a kind of trust that large, occasional gestures cannot replicate, because small promises are tested so frequently that the pattern becomes undeniable. Watch what happens when someone is corrected about something small and inconsequential. Do they get defensive over a minor factual error, or can they simply say, "You're right, I was wrong," without it costing them anything? How someone handles being corrected on something trivial is often a reliable preview of how they'll handle being corrected on something that actually matters. Watch how someone talks about people who aren't in the room. A person who speaks generously about others when those others can't hear it is showing you something about how they'll likely speak about you when you're the one who's absent. A person who uses someone's absence as an opportunity to criticize them is showing you exactly the same thing, aimed eventually in your direction. Trust also reveals itself in what someone is willing to admit not knowing. People who are building trust honestly tend to become more comfortable saying, "I don't know," or "I was wrong," over time, not less. People whose trustworthiness is a performance often become less able to admit uncertainty as a relationship deepens, because the performance requires an increasingly polished front. None of these signals are dramatic. That's precisely why they work. Real trust is not tested in the big moments people prepare for, it's revealed in the small ones nobody thought to perform for. Consider trust as something closer to a ledger than a single verdict, every small kept promise a deposit, every small broken one a withdrawal, with the balance quietly accumulating whether or not either party is consciously tracking it. This framing matters because it explains why trust, once seriously damaged, is so difficult to rebuild. It isn't one large repair that's needed, but a long accumulation of small deposits sufficient to outweigh the withdrawal, and most people underestimate how many small deposits that actually requires, because the emotional weight of a single significant broken trust rarely balances against an equal number of ordinary kept promises. Watch, too, for what someone does when trust would cost them something. It is easy to be trustworthy when honesty is convenient and costs nothing. The real test is what a person does when the truth is inconvenient, when admitting a mistake will cost them standing, when honoring a commitment will cost them comfort, when telling you something you don't want to hear will cost them your immediate approval. People reveal the true depth of their trustworthiness almost exclusively in these costly moments, because anyone can be trustworthy when it's free. Finally, notice how someone responds when you extend trust to them before they've fully earned it, a small vulnerability shared early, a benefit of the doubt given before the evidence is complete. Some people meet this early trust with visible care, aware that something was given to them ahead of schedule and treating it with corresponding gentleness. Others exploit it, treating early trust as an opening rather than a gift. How a person responds to being trusted slightly ahead of the evidence is one of the fastest ways to learn what kind of custodian they'll be of the fuller trust you might eventually consider giving them. There is a distinct category of trust worth naming separately: trust in someone's competence, as opposed to trust in their character. These are frequently conflated, and the confusion causes real damage. A person can be entirely trustworthy in character, honest and well-intentioned in every respect, while still being genuinely unreliable in competence, simply not equipped to deliver what they've promised. Reading trust accurately means evaluating both dimensions separately. Do I believe this person means what they say? And separately, do I believe this person is actually capable of following through? Collapsing these two questions into one leads people to either wrongly doubt someone's character over a competence failure, or wrongly extend responsibility to someone whose character is sound but whose capability isn't yet there. Watch, too, how trust is repaired after a genuine breach, because the repair process itself is as diagnostic as the original breach was. A person who, after breaking trust, becomes defensive, minimizes the impact, or rushes the other party toward forgiveness before real repair has occurred is showing you something important about how they'll likely handle the next breach as well. A person who, after breaking trust, slows down, tolerates the other party's continued caution without resentment, and rebuilds patiently through consistent small actions rather than grand apologetic gestures, is showing you a far more reliable foundation for whatever trust gets rebuilt afterward. Consider also how trust functions differently in professional relationships compared to personal ones, because the two are frequently governed by different underlying contracts even when they feel similar in the moment. Professional trust is often more transactional and role-bound. Trusting a colleague to deliver a report on time is a narrower trust than trusting a friend with a painful secret, and treating the two as interchangeable leads to real miscalibration in both directions. Someone can be entirely trustworthy within the narrow scope of a professional role while being someone you'd never extend deeper personal trust to, and recognizing this distinction protects you from either withholding reasonable professional trust out of excessive caution, or extending personal-level trust in contexts that were never designed to hold it. Finally, remember that trust, once genuinely earned over time, deserves to be treated as a real asset rather than something perpetually relitigated with every new interaction. Constantly testing someone who has already demonstrated years of reliability, simply out of habitual caution, is its own kind of quiet unfairness. It fails to extend the one thing that consistent trustworthy behavior is actually supposed to earn, the right, eventually, to be believed without having to prove it all over again. Finally, understand that healthy trust is not the same as unconditional trust, and learning to read people well should make you more discerning about where to extend trust, not simply more willing to extend it broadly. The goal of this chapter was never to make you trust everyone. It was to help you see, with real accuracy, exactly who has earned it, and exactly how much. Chapter 12, Reading Yourself First. Before you can read anyone else accurately, you have to be honest about what you bring into the room, because every observation you make about another person passes first through the filter of your own state, history, and expectation. The person who cannot read themselves will consistently misread others, projecting their own fear, insecurity, or hope onto behavior that has nothing to do with them. Ask yourself what you were hoping to see before you walked into a conversation. If you entered hoping someone was angry with you, you will find evidence of anger in ambiguous signals that could just as easily mean nothing. If you entered hoping for approval, you will read neutral expressions as warmer than they are. Expectation shapes perception more than most people are willing to admit, and the first step to reading others accurately is noticing what you expected to find before you started looking. Notice your own emotional weather before you try to read someone else's. A person in a defensive mode of their own will read neutral behavior as hostile more often than a person who is emotionally settled. This isn't a flaw unique to certain people, it's a universal distortion, and the only defense against it is checking your own state honestly before trusting your read of someone else's. Notice which behaviors in others trigger an outsized reaction in you, and get curious about why. Often, the traits that irritate us most sharply in others are traits we are uncomfortable with in ourselves. A person who cannot stand indecisiveness in others is frequently someone at war with their own uncertainty. Reading yourself first means catching these moments of projection before they masquerade as insight about someone else. The clearest lens for reading other people is a calm, self-aware mind. Every bias, wound, and hope you're carrying is a smudge on that lens. You cannot remove every smudge completely, no one can, but you can learn to notice when the lens is dirty, and that alone will make you a far more accurate reader of everyone around you. Build the habit of a brief internal check before any conversation that matters, a private, honest audit of your own state that takes only seconds but changes everything about your accuracy afterward. Ask yourself plainly, am I tired, am I anxious about something unrelated, am I carrying resentment from an earlier exchange today that has nothing to do with the person I'm about to speak with? Naming these things to yourself, even briefly, does not erase their influence entirely, but it moves them from an invisible force shaping your perception into a known variable you can consciously adjust for. Pay particular attention to the specific distortion of hope, because it is subtler and more dangerous than the distortion of fear. Fear-based misreading tends to be defensive and cautious, which, while inaccurate, rarely leads people into serious harm. Being overly wary of a trustworthy person is an error, but usually a survivable one. Hope-based misreading is more dangerous, because it leads people to override real warning signs in favor of the story they want to be true. Learning to notice when you are reading someone generously because the truth would be inconvenient, a partner you don't want to see red flags in, a business partner you've already invested too much in to doubt, is one of the most protective skills this entire book can offer you. Finally, understand that reading yourself is not a one-time audit but a continuous practice, because your own state shifts throughout any given day, and your accuracy as a reader of others shifts along with it. The version of you that is well-rested, secure, and emotionally settled will read a room with far more precision than the version of you running on exhaustion, insecurity, or unresolved conflict from 3 hours earlier. Protecting your own clarity, through rest, through honest reflection, through resolving your own emotional weather before entering rooms that matter, is not a separate discipline from reading people well. It is the foundation the entire skill rests on. Consider, too, how your own history with specific kinds of people shapes your reading of anyone new who resembles them, even superficially. A person who was let down by someone confident and charming earlier in life may find themselves unconsciously distrustful of confidence and charm in general, projecting an old pattern onto someone who has done nothing yet to earn that suspicion. This is not irrational, it is the mind doing exactly what it evolved to do, generalizing from past pain to protect against future versions of it. But left unexamined, it produces consistent misreadings of an entire category of people based on the specific actions of one or two individuals from your past. Naming these old patterns honestly, ideally with the support of a therapist or trusted confidant, is some of the most valuable work available to anyone serious about reading people accurately, because it clears distortion at the source rather than trying to correct for it moment by moment. There is also a particular self-reading worth developing around your own need to be right about a person once you've formed an opinion. Notice how it feels, physically and emotionally, when someone challenges a read you've already settled on, a friend defending someone you've decided is untrustworthy, new information complicating a story you'd already concluded. If the discomfort of being wrong outweighs your curiosity about the truth, that discomfort is worth examining directly, because it is precisely the condition under which accurate reading breaks down fastest. Consider, too, how your current emotional needs shape not just how you read people, but which people you're drawn to read closely in the first place. A period of loneliness may pull your attention disproportionately toward anyone offering warmth, inflating small kindnesses into significance they may not actually carry. A period of professional insecurity may make you unusually alert to signs of judgment from colleagues, even when none is intended. Understanding your own current season, what you're hungry for, what you're afraid of right now, helps explain not just distortions in how you read specific interactions, but patterns in who you find yourself watching most closely across an entire period of your life. Finally, build a simple practice of writing down, briefly and honestly, your read of an important person or situation before it resolves, and then returning to that note afterward to see how accurate you actually were. This small discipline, practiced consistently over months, will teach you more about your own specific blind spots than any amount of abstract self-reflection, because it gives you real, personal data about exactly where your reading tends to run ahead of the evidence, and exactly where it tends to lag behind it. Finally, treat this entire chapter as an invitation rather than a burden. Reading yourself first is not about achieving some impossible state of total self-awareness before you're allowed to engage with anyone else. It is about building the habit of checking in honestly, imperfectly, again and again, trusting that the accuracy this builds over time will be worth far more than the discomfort of occasionally catching yourself in a bias you'd rather not have noticed. Chapter 13, The Danger of Certainty. The moment you become certain you have someone figured out is the moment you stop actually watching them, and that is precisely when your reading of them becomes least reliable. Certainty feels like mastery. It is usually the opposite, a signal that you've stopped updating and started assuming. People are not static. The person who was anxious in every meeting last year may have grown more confident. The person who was reliable for a decade may be going through something that's changing their behavior right now, invisibly, for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Treating a past read as a permanent verdict is one of the most common ways people misjudge each other, because it substitutes an old snapshot for a moving picture. Certainty also makes people lazy about evidence. Once you've decided someone is a certain way, you start unconsciously collecting only the evidence that confirms it and dismissing the evidence that doesn't. This is not a character flaw, it is how the human mind is built to work, seeking consistency over accuracy. The only defense is a deliberate discipline, actively looking for evidence that contradicts your read of someone, not just evidence that supports it. Hold your reads of people the way a good scientist holds a hypothesis, useful until better evidence arrives, never sacred. This doesn't mean living in permanent doubt about everyone around you, it means staying open to revision, especially when someone's behavior surprises you. Surprise is data. Treat it as an invitation to update your model of a person, not as an anomaly to explain away so your original read can stay intact. The best readers of people are the most comfortable admitting they were wrong about someone. Not because they read people poorly, but because they understand that certainty is the enemy of accuracy, and staying a student of the people around you, even the ones you've known for decades, is the only way to keep reading them well. Consider how certainty tends to calcify fastest in the relationships that matter most: family members, long-term partners, old friends, precisely because these are the people we've had the most data on for the longest time, and therefore feel the most entitled to certainty about. This is a trap. The people we know longest are often the people whose growth we notice least, because our model of them was built early and rarely gets seriously revisited. A parent who still relates to their adult child as though they were the anxious teenager they once were, or a partner who still braces for a reaction their spouse stopped having years ago, is suffering from exactly this kind of outdated certainty, mistaking familiarity for current accuracy. There is also a specific danger in certainty formed under emotional duress. A conclusion about someone reached during a fight, a betrayal, or a moment of hurt tends to calcify faster and harder than conclusions reached calmly, precisely because strong emotion cements memory more powerfully than neutral observation. This means the reads you are most confident about are sometimes the ones you should scrutinize most carefully, because confidence born of pain is not the same as confidence born of accurate, patient observation, even though both feel identical from the inside. Practice, as a discipline, actively searching for the most recent piece of evidence that contradicts your existing view of someone close to you, at least once a month for the people who matter most. This single habit, deliberately hunting for disconfirming evidence rather than passively waiting for it to force its way past your existing certainty, is the single most effective defense against the slow, invisible process by which an accurate read calcifies into an outdated one, simply because no one thought to check. Consider also how certainty operates differently across a first impression versus a long-term read, because the mechanics of overconfidence differ meaningfully between the two. A first impression, formed in seconds, is fast and often surprisingly accurate on broad traits, but dangerously overconfident on specifics. People routinely believe they've correctly assessed someone's trustworthiness or competence within moments, when what they've actually assessed is something closer to a general vibe, dressed up as specific insight. A long-term read, by contrast, is slower to form but far more resistant to revision once it does, precisely because it's built on more evidence and therefore feels more justified in its confidence. Both forms of certainty deserve scrutiny, but for different reasons: the fast read for its thinness of evidence, the slow read for its resistance to updating even when better evidence eventually arrives. There is also a specific danger worth naming in certainty shared publicly, because declaring a read of someone out loud to other people tends to entrench that read far more deeply than holding it privately ever would. Once you've told others, "I've figured them out," reversing course costs you something socially, an admission not just that you were wrong about the person, but that you were wrong in front of an audience. This social cost creates a strong, largely unconscious incentive to keep defending an outdated read simply to avoid the discomfort of public correction. Being aware of this dynamic, and deliberately choosing to hold your reads of people more privately and provisionally, at least until you're genuinely confident in them, will protect you from this particular trap. Watch also for how certainty about a person often travels alongside certainty about an entire category. Once you've decided one person of a particular background, profession, or personality type behaves a certain way, there's a strong pull toward applying that same certainty to the next person who superficially resembles them. This is how individual misreadings quietly calcify into broader bias over time, one overconfident conclusion at a time. Actively resisting this drift, treating each new person as a fresh case rather than a confirmation of an existing category, is one of the most important, and most difficult, extensions of the discipline this chapter asks for. Finally, hold on to the genuine relief available on the other side of releasing false certainty. Many people resist admitting they were wrong about someone because it feels like a loss, an investment of judgment wasted. In reality, updating an inaccurate read is rarely a loss at all. It is simply arriving, later than you might have liked, at something more valuable than the certainty you were holding on to, the truth. Finally, remember that the discipline of resisting certainty is not the same as being wishy-washy or refusing to draw conclusions at all. Some conclusions are worth drawing firmly, and acting on decisively. The discipline this chapter asks for is narrower and more specific. Hold your conclusions firmly enough to act on them, but loosely enough to release them the moment genuinely new evidence arrives. That balance, firm enough to be useful, loose enough to stay accurate, is the entire art of reading people well over the long run.